Hi, I'm Marcia Lehman, and I'm a Knox County Master Gardener. Today, we're talking about the fifth P in the 5 Ps for growing vegetables in containers. And in fact, this one is 5A. It is specific about picking those cool season vegetables that we can grow in the spring and we can grow in the fall. And as we get closer to summer, we'll do a 5B on harvesting the summer vegetables. But today we're focused on the cool season veggies that we can grow in the spring and then again in the fall. And I'd also refer you to the handout that accompanies this video because it has a really nice table that lists the vegetable, which part of it do you eat, what's a little too early to harvest, what's the optimum point, and then when is it too late. So we'll start with beets. If you like beet greens, you can start harvesting those when they're a couple of inches tall. Just don't take all of them because the plant still needs them to produce the root. On the other hand, if you don't like the roots and you only like greens, well then yeah, harvest all the greens. But assuming that you're also growing this because you want to eat the roots, don't take all the leaves. Days to maturity are generally 50 to 70 days for most varieties. And they're ready when they're 2 to 3 inches in diameter. So don't think that you're going to grow a softball-sized beet. It's more like a baseball-sized beet or slightly smaller, maybe a tennis ball size. Because as they get bigger, their roots actually get tough and rather fibrous, and they're just not as tasty or as nutritious. When you harvest them, you'll notice this picture on the bottom, leave at least an inch of the stem on the bulb. Otherwise, when you go to cook them, you'll find that they bleed, especially if you try to boil them. You'll end up with a pot of really red water, and you've taken a lot of nutrition out of them. They store really well. They can also be canned, pickled, and even frozen. Broccoli. Don't wait for it to be as large as what you see in the grocery store. Your growing conditions in a container will not produce a head that is as large as in the grocery store. So if it gets to be softball size or larger, you've had a success. So that's about 4 inches in diameter or 4 inches across the top. And that's a good size to harvest. You can start a little smaller than that, especially if you're in a race with the arrival of summer heat. But about 4 inches across, and you want to cut a part of the stem with it because that's also edible, good to chop up and throw in salads for some crunch. The warning sign that you're waiting too long is that you start to see these little yellow flowers because broccoli is in fact a great big flower head. And so when you see these yellow flowers emerging, it is actually too late. It is starting to flower so that it can produce seed. And this is not going to be a particularly tasty. It will get a little strong. So if you're not sure, cut it a little early rather than a little late. Also, many varieties of broccoli, when you cut the main head, will then put out smaller shoots. And in this bottom photo, down here, we see the big head and the yellow flowers draw our attention. But over here's a little side shoot. So if you're not in a hurry to plant something else in the pot, let the rest of the plant sit there and see if it produces more side shoots. There are also some newer varieties of broccoli that don't get one big head, they just get a whole bunch of little side shoots. So if you bought a broccoli plant, read the tag carefully so that you know, should you be expecting to see one big head or multiple shoots coming off the stem. Carrots. Carrots are a favorite for everybody to try, and containers are a great place to grow them. Average days to maturity is between 50 and 75 days. You've sown these from seed, so check the seed packet because the smaller carrots won't take as long. Bigger carrots will take longer. So the tops of the carrots should have filled out. If the packet says they should get to be a ½ inch in diameter, then as you pull back the soil a little bit, or as they start to erupt out of the soil, you can see the top of the carrot, the top of the orange part. That's often called a shoulder. So when the shoulder starts to erupt out of the soil, and you can kind of see how wide it is, that's a good indication of when they're ready to pull. Now, don't harvest them too soon, because carrots harvested too soon are not particularly sweet, and they are not baby carrots. The things that you see in the grocery store that are labeled baby carrots are actually larger carrots that have been machined. They've been cut down mechanically, and that's why they're such a uniform size and shape. But immature carrots are edible, they just don't have much flavor. So when you go to pull a carrot, grab it close to the top of the actual orange part, but you've got your hand on the stem, the green part, and twist and pull to remove it from the soil or from your container. They are easier to pull out of a container than they are from when you're growing in ground or in a raised bed. So once you've pulled it, remove the leaves, because they will, the green part, that will continue to draw energy and moisture out of the carrots. And then that leaves them rather limp and they start to lose some sweetness. So harvest them and cut off the tops ASAP. Kale. There are a couple of types of kale. And again, those maturities vary depending on the type. So again, this was probably direct seeded, but if you bought a plant, check the tag. And I have pictures here of two different types of kale. The one on the top is our traditional curly leaf kale, and it's got lots of little wrinkles in it. It's actually my preference, although the challenge is with all those little curlicues in it, it'll take you a couple times to rinse it and spin it to get any debris out of it. And here, I would be cutting these leaves, and these ones on the bottom, I would be feeling. If they're really tough, then they're probably a little old, and so they could be removed and composted, but I would be picking the ones that are about hand size. Now, there's another type of kale, often called dinosaur kale or lacinato kale, and it doesn't have the same curly leaf. It has kind of a bumpy leaf, but instead of having a hand size kale leaf, it has a very long, I mean, it can be 12, 15, 18 inches long and maybe 2 or 3 inches wide. So again, I would go with younger, tender ones, and they would be 2 to 3 inches wide and maybe 12 to 15 inches long. As they get much longer than that, the edges are going to start to curl and get brown and won't be as tasty. And the dinosaur kale, the lacinato, is what is often called for in soups because it holds up better in cooking in a soup and doesn't just turn to mush. Lettuce. We have lots of different kinds of lettuce. We have a head lettuce. So this is actually a head lettuce here. And it is generally referred to as a butter crunch. While it is a head, it's not a tight head like an iceberg lettuce, so don't expect it to be that tight. And when you cut it, take a knife and cut it off, not all the way at the ground level, but maybe an inch above, and leave the stem in the ground, and it will often produce a second, smaller head. Here on the right is romaine. Those are a tighter head and a taller head. And generally, you only get one and done with these. So when you cut it off, you might cut it off at the soil level, peel off some of the outer layers, and this is just a really nice crisp lettuce. And then down here on the bottom are leaf lettuces. They don't get a head at all, and you would pick these when they're much smaller. And when I say pick, you're not going to go out and pick them with your hands. You should go out with probably a pair of scissors and snip off, again, not at ground level, but maybe an inch up. And on leaf lettuce, you keep harvesting and it will keep growing. So leaf lettuce is a great thing to start with if you're new to container gardening. And as you get comfortable with that, then maybe you can try some of the head lettuces. You can also grow a whole lot more leaf lettuce in a container, whereas on a head lettuce, depending on how big your container is, you may only get 1, maybe 2 heads in the container. Leaf lettuce, Man, you can sprinkle those seeds like we sprinkled carrot seeds. Bulbing onions. These are onions that form a nice big slicing bulb. In general, they have a very long days to maturity when you start them from seed. So you wouldn't be putting these seeds in your container. You would most likely have found what is called a start, which looks like a little baby onion. It is a green plant, maybe 6 to 8 inches tall, and has roots on the bottom of it. You put that in your container, and if you do that by mid-March, then by early summer, you should have bulbs that look much like the ones on the right that are starting to protrude up out of your container. They are ready to harvest when most of the tops have started to turn yellow, and most, probably 3/4 of them, have actually started to fall over. At that point, you have enough stem left, the other 25%, to grab a hold of and pull the onion from your container. If you wait longer and all the stems fall over, it is likely those stems will start to rot, and so will the bulb. So watching the greens turn yellow, and at about that 75% point is when you would harvest the bulbing onion. More likely you're growing some green onions. These are often called scallions. And again, these you can find seed and they would grow pretty quickly for you in a spring garden and in a container. But they don't form a bulb. They look like what's here on the right. They're about the same diameter all the way from roots, which have been trimmed here. But this is often how you see them in the grocery store. The roots have been trimmed off, and the very tips have been trimmed off because the tips have started to yellow. So this entire part is edible, although I would say most people definitely use the white part, and then maybe come up about this far, because as you get up closer to the tip, that's the older material, and it can be a little tough and a little less tasty. The point to these is harvest while the tops are all green. Watch the diameter and the height. So as they're getting to 8 to 10 inches tall, and the diameter is not yet a 1/2 inch. I mean, you want them bigger than the diameter of a pencil, but less than a 1/2 inch diameter, you're ready to pull. And you can pull these as you're ready to use them. So if you just need 3 or 4 for something you're cooking tonight, go pull 3 or 4 and let the rest in the pot till the time you need some more. Shelling peas. These might need a trellis as you're growing them in a container. There are some compact varieties, but the shelling peas are often also called English peas. And what we're growing to eat are the individual peas that are inside the pod. These are not edible pods, these are shelling peas. So they are ready, the picture on the right, they are ready. The pod is nice and plump. And as you can see, this pod has been opened and the peas are very full size. They are old when they start to get lumpy, when you can see the individual peas inside the pod have grown, that they're pressing out against the pod and making a very bumpy, lumpy pod. Those are old. But this picture on the right, this is a perfect stage for shelling peas. The pod is plump, the peas are full-sized, and you notice the pod has a little bit of a waxy sheen to it. That is optimum maturity for shelling peas. On the edible pod peas, these are often called sugar snaps. There are lots of varieties. You grow these to harvest and then you eat the entire pod. So again, they're ready when the pod is round. So this pea is definitely ready. This pea is definitely ready. This one back here looks more like a snow pea. It's not a snow pea, it's just an immature sugar snap. So this would be too early to harvest. These are prime. And again, if the pod is now constraining the pea seeds growing inside, this is old. Radishes. I did not include radishes in the handouts. Radishes are one of the fastest things to grow. You can go from seed to harvest in about 30 days, and they're easy to learn about. So I didn't think it was necessary to include radishes in the handout. When they're old, I mean, you will know, oh man, that one got too old. It'll be really strong. I mean, horseradish is technically a type of radish. It just happens to be a perennial. But if they're old, they will get very, very strong. What I wanted to point out is that, most people are familiar with this round red radish, which is the most common one we see. On the bottom right, these are called French breakfast radishes, and they're delightful. And they don't get as round, but they get longer. They get 2 to 3 inches long is optimal. They can get 4 inches long, but at 4 inches long, they're going to be pretty strong. The other thing that happens with any type of radish as it gets old, not only does it get strong, but it gets pithy. The texture in it changes, and it's kind of woody and fibrous and not a pleasant texture in your mouth. You can also have radishes that split because you let them get too old or they had irregular watering. If they went from being kind of dry to then very wet to dry again to wet again, they will split open, and those are not particularly tasty either. And then last on the list is spinach. Again, there are lots of different varieties of spinaches. They have different sized leaves. I like baby spinach, which you would harvest when the leaves are less than 3 inches, and at that point the stems are edible. There are other spinach varieties, like this is more of a baby on the bottom here. There are other types of spinach that, yes, you can pick the leaves when they're little, like this, and they'll taste like baby spinach, but you can also use them when the leaves are larger, and then you definitely have to remove the stem. So the leaf itself is quite tasty, quite edible, but on some of the larger leaf varieties, you would definitely want to remove the stem. And again, you are snipping individual leaves and letting the plant send out more leaves. It'll continue to grow until the summer heat arrives. Spinach doesn't like the heat, and so it'll either just die out or it will bolt and go to seed. So spinach, again, that's one of those things where there's lots of different varieties. Yeah, I like the baby so that I don't have to do as much trimming of stems. And so I tend to grow the variety that has smaller leaves. And they may do better in a container for you. Okay, so if you've got questions, go back and look at the handout. Look at not just the table of when to harvest, too early, optimal, and too late, but there's a list of some additional references. If you purchased any plants as transplants, keep those tags for the information and watch. I mean, if it says 50 days to maturity, make a note of when you planted it, and then track at about day 45, start to watch it more closely, because it could be a little early, but then, watch it from that point on and harvest it. Check catalogs, either online or in the paper catalogs. You can come to one of the farmers markets and ask a master gardener. And of course, you can always call the Ask a Master Gardener phone line in the extension office with any additional questions you may have. So that's it for when to harvest, the fifth P, picking, when to harvest the cool season veggies. Thank you for joining us today.